Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be here because, as many people, I too have a very personal connection with the Americas, and that is the most personal connection of all. My first girlfriend was from America. And even worse than that, her best friend's mum is here today, so that's a little bit awkward, but I think I'll work my way through it. As before mentioned, I work in the field of so-called futurology, which is better known as trend studies, because it removes the problem that people think you have a glass ball and you're going to tell them how the future works, or you can do it with cards. Today I'd like to introduce you to a few of the different tools we use to understand the world present and future, and then also go into a few of the theses that I personally developed. So I'd like to start off with the topic of what we call megatrends. This is our central, basically the DNA of our company. This is how we look at the world. And when we look at a phenomenon, it is quite important to distinguish what size of phenomenon we are talking about, because we as humans often have the tendency to make something a little bit bigger and more dramatic than it actually is. So it's always very helpful to look at a phenomenon and then look how far does its impact stretch. We have here it all ranging from our smallest unit, which is the product, all the way up to nature. And you will see there is a plethora of different options of trends. You can have branch trends, cultural trends, socioeconomic trends, megatrends, consumer trends, and meta trends. And we often, at least this is something that I encounter a lot, is I have to convince people that what is they consider to be a megatrend is actually just a hype. That is a lot of what I need to do. A megatrend is a revolution in slow motion. They're defined by about having a half-time of 50 years. So they move very, very slowly, which is why they're usually quite hard to detect for the normal eye, if I can say so. And I'd like to show you how we organize these megatrends. This is what we call the megatrend map. Everything that we do to understand trends is based in this. And you see it looks like a metro station plan. And there are 12 of these megatrends. So every megatrend is one colored line. And the real interesting things of our time usually tend to happen on the intersection points. So where multiple megatrends meet. The megatrends that I would like to talk to you about today are globalization, pretty self-explanatory. Connectivity. This is a term that in the German-speaking sphere has been beaten to death because it's called digitalization. You may know it in English that way. And this is a word that I hear about 20 times a day, and I can no longer hear it, which is why we have decided to give it a more, say, humane name. And I say this because we come, and as you heard, I'm a trained cultural and social anthropologist, we come from a more humanistic standpoint, less a technological one. So the interesting part for us is what is the human need behind all this technological crap? And the last trend that is very important to me, because it pertains a lot to generational questions, is individualization. So how we all have become more and more individualized. Before I hop into the material, one last thing that is very important to understand when we look at systems. This is what we call the lazy 8. I promise this is the only German slide I have. And all you really need to know is that every system usually is cyclical, and up here we have the crisis. So at the highest point of complexity and rigidity of a system, we come into a crisis. But the crisis only means that you need to restructure, find new ideas, innovate, and then, and that's the beauty of the system, go straight to the next crisis. So a crisis is a point of transformation, not the end. Another important, and this is the most overlooked model that is very easy to show, is the trend recourse trend. This is something that I teach at my university in Heidelberg a lot, and you can already tell the students there have quite difficulties actually understanding this. Every trend has a so-called recourse trend. So every time something happens, there is a force that pushes against it. And after a certain system conflict of these two, we get a so-called synthesis of the two. It is dialectic thinking, basically, but it can sometimes be quite hard, especially when we are personally involved. I'll give you an example. You may know, sometimes you might hear more of it, I don't mean to offend anyone, that vegan is quite cool at the moment. And a lot of people talk about veganism. And this is a vegan magazine, quite prominent one, and when I'm traveling for work, I often see the counter trend to this at the airport. And what is the counter trend? It is beef, right? So this is, you see, this is through veganism. There has become there has become a wish to consume meat that is actually of quality and think about what you consume. What is the synthesis of these two? Is what we call flexitarians. 35% of Germans say they're flexitarians. I believe some of them are lying, myself included, but generally this is how most trends develop. And so you will see we get a big amount of trend terms that are paradox. So we have real digital, paradox, right? Freemium, co-opetition, a trend that I would like to talk about later, glokalisation or flexicurity. So you see, this is the general development of how we see trends to develop. There is no way to understand the future if you don't understand society. And so I would like to present to you a few societal trends that I've noticed and that we study. The most important one is called down aging. So every generation, older people behave 7.4 years younger on average, which is good news for most of you. Sorry about that one. Came right out of me. This is how a 40-year-old couple looked in the year 1940s, right? And this is how they look today. This is how all of you look, obviously.
Good recovery.
So, through discovering this, we noticed that we require a new model of looking at the life of an individual and the life of society, because it has appeared that the biographic model doesn't really apply anymore. The biographic model is very linear, and human life has become a lot less linear. So I'd like to take you on a short journey on how the way we live has developed, and we end up with what we call, instead of biographies, we call them multiographies. So this is how we used to live in the year 1900. You see, the further we go to the right, the bigger the unit of living is. So these are 5+ person households over here, and all the way down over here are single households. And in the 1900s, the only people who lived alone were widows and orphans. Now, if we move towards what we would call industrialization, you see the large family model isn't quite working out as well anymore. We require smaller living cohorts in order to manage industrialization. Moving forward, 2020, this is about how we're going to live, and you see there is a plethora of different ways of living. But you see, the single households are becoming quite big. If we now think in the classical trend pattern that I showed you before, linear, straightforward, this is the future we are facing, a so-called atomized future, where everyone is basically living alone and sometimes communicating via their smartphones, probably from their bed, which is a future that I would prefer not to live in. But if you use the thesis of trend and recourse, you will see, and this is happening right now, is what we call social recursion. People do want to be with one another. It just may be the fact that the primary unit of being together isn't always the core family. This is the individual life of a person in the 1960s. So you had 20 years of childhood and adolescence. On average, you married with 23. Then, and this is very important, you worked for 40 years in the same job at the same place. And then you had a solid 5.5 years until you fell out of the statistic, I'll put it that way. Which, as you may know, isn't very accurate anymore. The new life models look a lot more like this. This is a 7-phase model. You could even argue that there's more. And you can see it is more differentiated. So we go from childhood to post-adolescence, rush hour, selfness, maturation, and I think we can all agree in the end we wish to get to wisdom. Now, what has also changed, and this is why I was so focused on the work block on the one before, is how work and education has changed. So nowadays, remember that one big green block that you used to work in? This is no longer the case. People want to alternate when they work, if they get furtherly educated. Sometimes they do both at the same time. So the pattern has changed. And you will sometimes notice in quite a few fields that the way we think is still very industrialized and thinks about factories more than the individual life. And what has also changed, I can attest to this, is how love works. So you have a lot more partners on average nowadays, and it's not always all so great. Robert Keegan put these life phases into a stairway. And as said, I think we can agree that we want to come from childhood all the way up to wisdom. Every time you move up a layer, there is a crisis, and then a transformation, as mentioned at the start. Now the good news, the very good news is you have the ability to tap out of this. You can just say, I'll stay in puberty forever. And you know people like this. I know people like this. Okay? So in that case, you become regressive. Or you can become autonomous but never really figure out how to have a long functioning relationship, then you're an idiot or drunk or both. I heard sometimes that you can go in tandem. Whereas obviously there are also things that are outside of our control. And what we found out of this, if you go deeper into the numbers, is that the classical, consistent cohort generational model doesn't really work anymore. And that's a bit frustrating for many people who want to think in X, Y, Z, and then what comes next. This is mainly because very consistent, homogeneous cohorts are created by extremely dramatic events. And so the generation after the Second World War was incredibly homogeneous. So a generational model worked very well there. Whereas nowadays, through individualization, this is just not the case anymore. So this leads us to a world where the differences within a cohort are bigger than between cohorts. So it becomes very hard to distinguish between them. So you are faced with the, some people would say, issue that you have to judge most people based on the way they actually are. For some people it becomes a problem. Now, a question that I get asked a lot, due to, I guess, my age, is how the hell do we employ millennials? How does that work? And Jennifer J. Deal did some research on this and found out, and I agree with most of what she said, is that the differences between individuals are bigger than between cohorts, as already mentioned. The next line is very important. The work and life needs have not fundamentally changed in the past 50 years, because many people assume or say that younger generations actually are completely different on what they want and what they need, and this is actually not the case. The third thesis, I'm not quite sure, I'm not sure if I agree that after 5 years within the workforce, any generational belonging disappears. And a very nice anti-cliche to all of the digital madness that you hear nowadays is that 90% of so-proclaimed millennials actually prefer face-to-face feedback. So this illusion that when companies come to us and they're like, oh, we're very modern because we do our meetings over FaceTime, then I'm like, congratulations, you messed it up. That's not the entire point of our venture. If you remember nothing of what I just said because you had a bit too much champagne this morning, this is the central message that I require you to remember, that in the past, we were born into collectives and had to find our individuality. So that is the generation of my father, for instance, and my mother. That was rebellion. My father was a hippie and my mother was a punk, okay? So I know about this. Yeah? Whereas nowadays, we were born as extremely individualized, as you may have noticed, and this is what many people complain about these damn millennials, and are now looking for community. That is the big change in society. Someone listening to my, that's my podcast intro. I just recognized that. I was like, what is it? All right, lovely. Well, that's some good advertisement there. I didn't think. Okay. Due to time reasons, now when we were trying to work on generational theses, we decided, okay, age doesn't work. That's not a good indicator anymore. So we went for something different. We went for globalization as a value to define a generation, which is why we wrote this beautiful study called Generation Global. And whilst we were working on this, we actually figured out that the picture that most of us have of the globalized world isn't in sync. Many of us have very different images of how the world actually is as to how they seem it is. This is the so-called global ignorance test. I don't know if you know this man, Hans Rosling, he recently died, but he is the man with all the data in the world. And just a fun trivia fact, because we work together with his son, and I know his son quite well at this point, is Barack Obama came to him before he got into the presidency and said, tell me how the world really looks. Which I thought was a nice trivia fact, to be honest, as an AmCham Austrian. So, this test is usually done on big conference rooms, and it just asks very basic questions about how the world actually is. What is the state of our global world? And if you ask how high is average life expectancy, the answers you get range from 45 to 70. And the correct answer is by now over 70 already. Now, if you ask how high is the percentage of illiteracy worldwide, yeah? You have 40, 30, or 20%. We're way below 20% already, but in every room we have done, every conference we have asked, they're all sitting on 40 or 30%. This is how literacy, because this is the thing, this is what you think of first. As soon as you think of the question of illiteracy, the first thought you have is, can kids in Africa read? And the answer now is yes, it's important. And a beautiful one which we made quite emblematic of our media age is, in the last 20 years, is death by natural catastrophes developed. How has it? And I think you understand how this works now. If I ask you has it doubled, state the same or halved, the correct answer is, of course, it is more than half. Just so we get on a baseline of the world we're actually talking of. Because I think a bit of a disconnect is that the world that my generation and the generation after, maybe even before, knows, factually, is like that. And the world that many people describe is quite different, and the public perception is quite different, which is important. Let us get into the meat of the trend of globalization now that we're on a level playing field. Globalization has been quite a strong trend as of late, I think you've heard. And now we're getting the time where the counter trend, called nationalism or localization, depending on how you want to frame it, is coming back. And I'm not giving these any value, this is just trend facts. The synthesis of the two of them is what we call glokalism. So the mixture between the global and the local, because these two do not have to be at odds with one another, right? Especially through the times of the internet, everyone, if they want to, can be a localized cosmopolitan. That is new. That wasn't always possible. Either you were part of the aristocracy and you traveled all the time and you were super mobile, or you were a peasant, stuck. Those were your two options. This is no longer the case. So, in short, you could say you can be globally connected and have local roots. And this opens up a new world for us, and I'd like to just give you two examples of where you can notice this quite strongly. This is what we call social globalization, and the function of it is what we call productive difference. So, also quite a new phenomenon, if you look in a bigger timeline, is the fact that if you have people from different places working together, and I think America, for instance, is obviously a quite good example of this, is the friction that is created there can be used for productivity. Some people will try to tell you you can use it, or it's a sign of not working well together, but friction can and should be used as productivity. This obviously happens in cultural sense and so on. And where does this happen in the business world? Where I'm more at home is that more and more businesses are working towards what we would call a network organization, so localized units. And I'd like to give you a classical word that you've heard in this context and reframe it a bit for you. This is what you know is outsourcing, so this is us, the evil West, well, sucking the rest of the world dry, essentially. And if you look at the world through what we call the global lens, this term turns into what we call nearshoring. So multiple different locations know their individual strengths, can band together as small local units, but still have the benefit of the global network. This is what the future is going to look like. And the sociologist David Goodhart divided humanity quite, maybe a bit polemically, into two sides. The so-called somewheres, who you would classically know as people who are rooted in a specific place and often less educated, so what you would call in a greater, grander sense, globalization losers, the losers of globalization. And then you have the anywheres, which is all of you and including me. And these are people who are usually footloose, urban, and socially liberal. So this is kind of a bit of a polemic divide, because obviously there are shades in between, but it's a good framing for how we see globalization work on the population. This is, if you look at the world through connections and megacity clusters, so cities that are bigger than 25 million, you will notice that the image you get is actually quite indicative of how we order our world in general, if we look at the global world. And if you go deeper into this topic of what do cities mean within the global and global context, we have come to the conclusion that cities will actually become a contender to the homogeny of what we classically would understand as nation states, because they are inherently local. They're localized, but they also make very good use of their connections towards other cities. And I think it's quite important here to mention that the thing that we've noticed is that local politicians always enjoy vastly higher numbers of appreciation in the polls than national politicians, which is quite interesting. And I forgot who it was, but someone once said there is no democratic or republican way of fixing a pothole. And that's actually quite inherently correct. So if we go back to this classical division between the somewheres, so as you see here, this is in the same city, right? People who are not socially mobile, and the people who are extremely socially mobile. We need to be able to envision a future and work towards a future where we get to what we would call everywhere, right? Where, and this is quite a good example for it, because this is a city in South America where they have connected the favelas with the rich part of the district through this cable line. And there was quite a good saying by I think it was an American mayor who said, a good city, or the sign of a good city, isn't that poor people already have a car, it is that rich people like taking public transport. And I thought that was actually quite a smart thing to say. To round this off, I would just like to tell you that as much as the theories of this madman at the front talking about cities replacing nation states, there is actually already a political effort and a political reality of this happening. This is called the Global Parliament of Mayors. Once a year, the mayors of, it's like by now it must be 350 or 290 big cities meet up and discuss local solutions. And it was founded by the old mayor, I think, of New York, Benjamin Barber, who's recently passed away, but this is still living on. So there's a political movement to use the energy that we see in the so-called local in order to make some of the difficulties that we are facing with having the nation state as an organizational matrix for our world. They're trying to correct that. Thank you very much.